So, Dr. Andy Woods is our next speaker, and Andy did a doctoral dissertation at Dallas on the topic stated up there, Futurist Response to the Preterist Interpretation of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. And so he's going to give us a summary, of that particular study. And Andy is a professor at College of Biblical Studies in Houston, as well as the pastor at Sugarland Bible Church as well. So let her rip, Tater Chip.
All right. Okay, well, as Tommy mentioned, this presentation is called a Futurist Response. Am I standing in the wrong place or something? Oh, okay. A Futurist Response to the Preterist Interpretation of Babylon in the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and 18. Let me just sort of start, if I could, with a definition of preterism. Preterism is the view, as most people know, that the book of Revelation was written in the mid-60s, and the prophecies of the futuristic section of the book, chapters 4 through 22, were mostly fulfilled in the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And preterists believe that what the book of Revelation predicts is Rome's AD sacking of Jerusalem. And once that occurred, that represented God's divorce, judgment, and replacement of Israel by the universal church. Of course, there's a distinction between full preterists and partial preterists. Full preterists believe all of chapters 4 through 22 are fulfilled, and a partial preterist leaves a few slivers, for the future. Kenneth Gentry is kind enough to leave us verses 7 through 15 of Revelation 20. But other than that, everything is fulfilled. Now, Revelation 17 and 18, believe it or not, are a prominent feature of the preterist interpretation. They're very significant. This is a section of Scripture dealing with the Babylonian harlot who is destroyed by the beast. And the brand of preterism that I'm dealing with here defines Babylon, the harlot city, as first century Jerusalem. The beast that she is riding on is first century Rome. And when the beast destroys the harlot in Revelation 17, verses 16 and 17, that supposedly represents the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in AD 70. Now, people hear this view and they say, that's the craziest view I've ever heard. But it's very prominent in the thinking of preterists. They're very confident that they have it right. So Kenneth Gentry says, I am convinced beyond any doubt. I mean, that's very strong language. I am convinced beyond any doubt that this harlot is first century Jerusalem. Hank Hanegraaff puts it this way. He says, what has puzzled me over the years is not the identity of the great prostitute, but how so many could have missed her historical identity. In biblical history, only one nation is inextricably linked to the moniker harlot, and that nation is Israel. So preterists are saying, this harlot is obviously first century Jerusalem. And as I began to look into this and study it, I was just shocked at how many commentators, older commentators and modern commentators, believe this position. Commentators like Philip Carrington, J.S. Russell, Milton Terry. Many recent commentators and voices that you are probably familiar with hold to this position. R.C. Sproul, N.T. Wright has made a few statements that seems to indicate he believes this. You might recognize the name Scott Hahn, the Roman Catholic apologist, is a espouser of this view. Other commentators would include Ford, Chilton, Hanegraaff, and Gentry. And as you begin to sort of fish around on the internet, what you begin to discover is there are actually full-length books written to convince their audiences that the harlot city, Babylon, of Revelation 17 and 18, is really the city of Jerusalem in particular and the nation of Israel in general, which was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Now, there is an older view of preterism that I'm not dealing with at all. There's an older view of preterism that indicates that Babylon the harlot is Rome, and I'm not dealing with that. I'm dealing with the newer brand of preterism that is being espoused today in these books and commentaries that identifies Babylon as first century Jerusalem. So let me share with you where I want to go in this presentation. This presentation is called a response to the preterist interpretation of Babylon. So I'm spending most of my time responding to their arguments. I wanted to get into their minds and see how they could actually reach this conclusion. So I'm going to respond to some arguments from within Revelation 17 and 18. And then I will respond to some arguments outside of Revelation 17 and 18 that they use. And then I'll sort of wrap up my thoughts by laying out some general weaknesses with the preterist interpretation. And just so you don't think this is purely academics, I was in Barnes & Noble just the other day, and I pulled out Hank Hanegraaff's book on, answers to questions in the Bible, and there's a section right there where he's trying to argue to the lay people that Babylon, in Revelation 17 and 18, this harlot city, is first century Jerusalem. So let me start with some arguments from within Revelation 17 and 18 that they use, and so maybe we can understand their thinking a little bit better. One of their main arguments is they note from Revelation 17, verses 1 and 2, that Babylon is called a harlot. And the logic of their view is you cannot commit harlotry unless you have a pre-existing covenant with God. And then they note that only Israel had a pre-existing covenant with God. And so therefore, the logic is the harlot of Revelation 17 must be the nation of Israel. And they'll go through a plethora of Old Testament passages. Very prominent are Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23, which call the city of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel a harlot. And so they say, well, this is the harlot that John is speaking of in Revelation 17. So what is the response to that? Well, one response that I like to give is that harlot imagery does not exclusively identify the city of Jerusalem. Gentile cities in the Old Testament are also called harlots. Tyre was called a harlot, Isaiah 23, verse 16. Nineveh was called a harlot, Nahum 3, verse 4. Now, preterists are very well aware of those two passages, Isaiah 23, verse 16, and Nahum 3, verse 4. And so this is how they sort of mitigate against it. David Chilton says, "It is noteworthy that Tyre and Nineveh, the only two cities outside of Israel that are accused of harlotry, had both been in covenant with God." In my mind, that is a tremendous overstatement. I do not believe that Tyre nor Nineveh was in a covenant with God. Now, it's true that Nineveh had contact with God through the preaching of Jonah, but that's not the same thing as a covenant. Tyre, for example, had a contract worked out with Solomon in the building of the temple, but that was a covenant with Solomon, not a covenant with God. Another argument that they rely upon is Babylon's alliance, and they make quite a bit about Revelation 17, verse 3, the woman riding the beast. And so, according to their interpretation, the woman is the nation of Israel riding the beast, or Rome, prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And they produce a vast amount of Bible verses which speak of how the nation of Israel was sort of a cohort of Rome. The two were on the same side in their opposition to the church. The two were on the same side in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And for example, a verse like John 11, verses 48 through 50 is very prominent in their thinking. And so in Revelation 17, verses 16 and 17, Israel's relationship with Rome is later broken when Rome invaded Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, what are some responses to that? Well, one response is there really never was much of an alliance between Israel and Rome. Notice what Greg Beale says. Jerusalem was never a full-fledged ally with Rome. Of course, the two were on the same spiritual side in their opposition to the church, but what is portrayed in Revelation 17 is a much stronger spiritual, political, and economic alliance than Jerusalem ever had with Rome. Now, this is especially true if you remember when preterists date the book of Revelation. They date it in AD 65, roughly, and it's a prophecy about the events of the Jewish war culminating in AD 70. And so by the time the book of Revelation is written, Jerusalem was never, in any sense, in an alliance with Rome. Here's what Dr. Thomas says, who's here today. He might be surprised to see his picture up there, so I want to prepare him for that. But he writes, Rome's prolonged siege and destruction of Jerusalem from the late 60s to 70 hardly gives the impression of any alliance between the Jews and the Romans. And this is particularly true when you get the imagery of Revelation 17, verse 3. The woman is riding the beast. In other words, the woman is controlling the beast. And how could it be said that Jerusalem was in control of Rome? Certainly that was never the case. It was the opposite, wasn't it? Jerusalem was under the thumb of Rome. Well, another argument that they rely upon is color arrangements. And they very quick to point out in Revelation 17, verse 4, and Revelation 18, verse 16, that there are certain colors associated with the harlot Babylon. For example, she is clothed in scarlet, purple, and gold. And then the preterists very quickly run to the institutions of Judaism, and they point out the exact same color arrangements in the institutions of Judaism. They say, aha, the same colors are present in the high priest's attire, Exodus 28, verse 5. The same colors are apparent in the tabernacle furnishings, Exodus 25, verse 4. So what would be a response to this argument from color? Well, as I look at these colors are basically generic colors. They are not designed by the Spirit of God, I believe, to reveal particular nations. For example, the color scarlet is simply the opposite of purity, as in Isaiah 1, verse 18. The color purple is simply significant of royalty, as in Judges 8, verse 26, and other passages. So I believe that these color arrangements are being pushed way too far beyond what John intended when he penned the Apocalypse. These are just generic colors, not designed to identify specific nations. And it's also very interesting to point out that whatever your view is of Babylon, everybody appeals to color. People that believe that Babylon is the Roman Catholic Church do the same thing with the Roman Catholic priests' robes. My view, which is literal Babylon, I do the same thing with the colors that Daniel was adorned with by Belshazzar when he interpreted the handwriting on the wall. So arguments from color are very, very specious in my mind. In fact, I was sharing this with my wife, how preterists identify Jerusalem with these colors, a gold and purple, and she says, well, we might as well make an argument that this is the Los Angeles Lakers. It's in their old uniforms. That was their color. A big deal is made of Babylon's title, Revelation chapter 17, verse 5. And as you all know, Revelation 17, verse 5 says this, and on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And what they're arguing here is this title that is inscribed upon the harlot's forehead is a parody, if you will, of the Jewish high priest. Exodus 28, verses 36 through 38, God inscribed on the high priest's turban, holiness unto the Lord. And when the nation of Israel in the Old Testament wandered away from God, God told the nation of Israel in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 3, you have been given a harlot's forehead. And so consequently, preterists are arguing the same thing is going on here. Israel rejected Jesus Christ, and so God inscribed upon her forehead this title of the great harlot. So what would be a response to some of these arguments? Well, they make a big deal about Jeremiah 3, verse 3, the harlot's forehead, but very interestingly, they leave out Jeremiah 3, verse 17, just a few verses later. This happens constantly in their writings, but they neglect the verses which talk about Israel's restoration, just a few verses later. Now, so they ignore this restoration language. Now, as you get into these chapters, a lot is being done with what is written on the harlot's forehead. Preterists want you to see the concept of Jerusalem when you read the word Babylon in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. And one of the main arguments that's used is they want the title to read Mystery Babylon. And so here's F.F. Bruce. F.F. Bruce, of course, is not a preterist, but he exhibits the mindset. He says, this title written on her forehead, Mystery. Mystery indicates that the name she bears is not meant to be understood literally, but allegorically. Babylon the Great is read, but Rome is meant. And he believes he can substitute the word Rome for the word Babylon because, after all, the harlot's title is Mystery Babylon, which in his mind communicates symbolic Babylon. Now, as you get into this, you quickly see that there are two ways to read the harlot's title. In the upper hand of the screen, you'll notice that the word mystery is capitalized, indicating that mystery is part of the harlot's forehead. That's how the King James Version and the NIV translate the verse. At the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that mystery is not capitalized, indicating that mystery is not part of the harlot's forehead. That's what the NASB does. Of course, preterists, almost every time they cite this verse, are using the King James Version or the New International Version. But I think it's the NASB that has it right. And the reason I think the NASB has it right is because the phrase Babylon the Great is referred to, I believe, 6 other times in the Apocalypse. And every time you see that title, Babylon is never called Mystery Babylon the Great. She is always called simply Babylon the Great, and her advent is a mystery or an undisclosed idea. And it's very interesting when you drop down to Revelation 17, verse 7, you'll see that the mystery applies not just to Babylon, but it applies to Babylon and the beast. It's Babylon's destruction of the beast, or the beast's destruction of Babylon. I have that backwards. The beast's destruction of Babylon. That's the mystery, not what is written on the harlot's forehead. But one of the big problems with this view that somehow Babylon means Jerusalem is everybody agrees that John in the book of Revelation is heavily using the Old Testament. Everybody agrees he's using Jeremiah 51. Jeremiah 51 is very prominent in these chapters. And all the way through the Old Testament, particularly in Jeremiah 51, you learn that Babylon is distinct from Israel, always. So if John, who's borrowing so richly from the Old Testament, in the book of Revelation, as he pens the Apocalypse under the Spirit of God, and the Old Testament keeps those two entities always distinct, why would they be suddenly merged here? But preterists want you to believe that the word Babylon is some kind of code. They want you to believe Babylon is some kind of code for Jerusalem. And the major problem with it, Greg Beale points it out, he says there is not one example of Babylon ever being a symbolic name for Israel, either before or after AD 70. This does not mean that such an application is impossible, but the burden of proof rests upon those maintaining the Babylon equals Jerusalem identification. And that's a very important point that he's making. He's saying as you go through the Bible, Babylon is never used as a code word for Jerusalem. As you go outside the Bible into extra-biblical sources, Babylon is never used as a code word for Jerusalem. Now, the Rome view, at least it has going for it, non-canonical sources using Babylon as a code for Rome. But you don't have that with Jerusalem. So what do the preterists do? Well, what they do is they seek refuge in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. 1 Peter 5, verse 13. You all heard Dr. Fruchtenbaum's presentation yesterday. It's got that famous statement in it, "She who is from Babylon greets you." And many people believe Peter was in Rome when he wrote that, so therefore Babylon is a code word for Rome. The Preterists, on the other hand, believe that Peter was in Jerusalem when he wrote that statement. So therefore Babylon in 1 Peter 5, verse 13 is some kind of code word for Jerusalem. And what Russell does in his commentary of the Parousia is he quotes all these verses connecting Peter to the city of Jerusalem. And he says, well, of course, Peter was in Jerusalem when he wrote these words, and therefore Babylon is a code word for Jerusalem. Now, the problem with these verses that he's quoting is, as you look at them carefully, they are all pre-Acts 15 verses. In other words, these are all verses that describe either the Jerusalem Council or what happened beforehand. So in other words, these are all pre-AD 49 verses. And, of course, we know that 1 Peter was probably written about AD 64. And so the whole view begins to collapse when you begin to understand that Peter traveled quite a bit between the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 and when he finally penned the epistle. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5 indicates Peter did a lot of traveling. Dionysius, I have him cited, I think in your paper. Dionysius argues that Peter actually made it all the way to Corinth. So therefore this idea that Babylon in 1 Peter 5 verse 13 is some kind of code word for Jerusalem, I don't think the argument is that strong at all. Now, the preterist view really stumbles over the expression, the mother of harlots, in Revelation 17 verse 5. Notice that it's articular, adding emphasis. This harlot is not a mother of harlots, but she is the mother of harlots. And most commentators understand the mother of harlots as the source of all harlotry. Notice what Clarence Larkin says. He says, "Therefore Euphrates, on which the city of Babylon was built, to this center the forces of evil gravitated after the flood, and Babel was the result. This was the origin of the nations, but the nations were not scattered abroad over the earth until Satan had implanted in them the virus of a doctrine that has been the source of every false religion the world has ever known." Alexander Hislop, if you buy his interpretation, traces the origin of the mother-child cult from the Tower of Babel into all of the nations that followed. It's just the names got changed around as this mother-child cult was exported. So we can understand how the Tower of Babel would be the source of all harlotry. Well, if you're trying to tell me that this harlot is Jerusalem, how in the world do you get the idea that Jerusalem is somehow the source of all harlotry? It really doesn't make sense. Jerusalem is never called a mother harlot all the way through the Bible. There's a reference in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, I have that mentioned at the bottom of your screen, where Jerusalem is a daughter harlot, but she is not the mother of all harlots. The mother-child cult did not originate from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, if anything, absorbed the mother-child cult, but she is not the originator of the mother-child cult. And furthermore, Jerusalem doesn't even become a Jewish city until the time of David, which would be about AD 1000. So how could a city that falls into Jewish hands in AD 1000, that appears so late on the stage of world apostasy, how could that city ever be thought of as the mother of all harlots? Another argument that they rely upon very strongly are prophecies that John makes in Revelation 18, verse 20, and Revelation 18, verse 24, referring to Babylon's persecution. And so they camp on these verses, and they have a major premise. They like to set up these sort of syllogisms, so I'm just going to follow their syllogism to its logical conclusion. Their major premise is that Babylon slays the prophets and the apostles, Revelation 18:20. Their minor premise is that Jerusalem killed both the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament apostles. So the conclusion, therefore, is Babylon equals Jerusalem. Notice how Kenneth Gentry states this. Here, Gentry is dismissing Rome as an interpretation of Babylon. He says Rome was stained with the blood of the saints, yet Rome had only recently entered the persecuting ranks of God's enemies. Throughout Acts, Jerusalem and the Jews were the main persecutors. Furthermore, Rome was not guilty of killing any of the prophets of the Old Testament, as was Jerusalem. So what he's saying is only Jerusalem killed both the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament apostles. And the view, I think, dissolves when you begin to understand that prophets and apostles are not technical terms. These are terms which demonstrate a broad semantic range. In Dr. Fruchtenbaum's presentation, he brought up the reality of New Testament prophets. I have all the verses on the screen which could indicate you can have a New Testament prophet. A prophet in the book of Revelation doesn't have to refer to an Old Testament prophet. After all, we're going to have two eschatological prophets in the end times. The word apostle is the same way. Yeah, there's a technical meaning to the term, referring to the original 12, but sometimes the word is used in a non-technical sense, referring to a common sent one or a common missionary. Now, on the subject of Babylon's persecution, they go a little bit further, and here's another major premise they have. Babylon slays the prophets, Revelation 18, verse 20, and Revelation 18, verse 24. Minor premise, only Jerusalem killed the prophets. And they make a great deal out of Luke 13:33, which indicates that no prophet was ever slain outside of Jerusalem. So their conclusion is, well, Babylon, or Revelation 17 and 18, must be the city of Jerusalem. Here's Joseph Belliade, a preterist, and here's how he articulates this. He says, if the righteous blood of all of the prophets is to come upon Jerusalem, then how can the righteous blood of all of the prophets also come upon Babylon? The only solution to this question is our original premise that Babylon is indeed merely a figurative name used by John to describe apostate Jerusalem. Jesus stated clearly in Luke 13:33, surely no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. Well, if you look at their minor premise, only Jerusalem killed the prophets, this whole syllogism collapses when you understand that the minor premise of it is not accurate. There are several prophets in the Bible that died outside of Jerusalem. Heck, Jesus in Matthew 23:35 mentions Abel as the first prophet, and Abel is killed before Judaism even exists. Jeremiah likely was killed in Egypt. Paul and Peter probably in Rome. John in Asia Minor. So I think that their minor premise here is not correct. Another argument that they rely on very heavily is Babylon's influence. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and verse 18, it speaks of the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And they make a big deal about that phrase, great city. And here's another syllogism that they use. Major premise. Great city refers to Jerusalem earlier in the book of Revelation. Now that's true because in chapter 11, verse 8, great city where their Lord was crucified clearly is a reference to the city of Jerusalem. But their minor premise, Babylon is called the great city in Revelation 17 and 18. Conclusion, Babylon equals Jerusalem. I mean, after all, if Jerusalem is identified as the great city early on, and that's the first reference to the great city, then all subsequent references to the great city in the book of Revelation must be the city of Jerusalem. Now, Russell, notice what he says. Russell says, if then the great city of chapter 11, verse 8 means ancient Jerusalem, by parity of reasoning, the great city in chapter 17, verse 18, and elsewhere must also refer to Jerusalem. Now, I think this overlooks a lot of things. As you go through the Old Testament, remember John is heavily relying upon the Old Testament. As you go through the Old Testament, Jerusalem and Babylon are always different. So that opens up the possibility of two great cities. I mean, why can't we have in the book of Revelation two great cities? I mean, don't we have two great cities in Texas, Dallas and Houston, for example? Why can't we have two great cities in the book of Revelation? And as you look at contextually, chapter 11, verse 8, and chapter 17, verse 18, you very quickly see that there are two great cities in view. The name is different. In chapter 11, the city is referred to as Jerusalem, but in chapter 17, she is called Babylon. The geography is different. In chapter 11, she is referred to as Sodom and Egypt. Those are the geographical terms used. But in chapter 17, the reference is to Babylon. The martyrdoms are different. We've got two martyrs, two prophets martyred in chapter 11. But in chapter 17 and 18, we have apostles and prophets who are martyred. The division of the city is different. The city is divided into tenths, a tenth, I believe, in chapter 11, verse 8. But we have the city divided into thirds in chapter 17. The earthquake is different. Chapter 11, the earthquake is not called the greatest earthquake in human history, but in chapter 17, the earthquake is called the greatest earthquake in human history. The chapter 11 city is in connection with the seventh trumpet. The city in chapter 17 is in connection with the seventh bowl. The temple imagery is prominent in chapter 11, but the water imagery is prominent in chapter 17. The time indicators are different. 42 months, 3.5 days are mentioned in chapter 11, but as you get into chapters 17 and 18, you see that 1 day or hour is mentioned. There's a satanic gift exchange going on in chapter 11, but there is no such gift exchange described in chapter 17. The descriptors are different. The adverb spiritually is used in chapter 11, but the noun mystery is used in chapter 17. So I think there's a pretty good case to be made that we're dealing with two great cities in the book of Revelation, both the city of Jerusalem on one hand and the city of Babylon on the other. A major stumbling block to their view is continuing on in chapter 17, verse 18, where it says, the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, how in the world are you going to argue to me that little first century Jerusalem was reigning over the kings of the earth? And so I was very interested in what they were going to say about this. And they assemble lots of material from within the Bible and lots of material outside the Bible, like the writings of Josephus, for example, describing Jerusalem as a famous city. And I'm not disputing the fact that first century Jerusalem was a famous city. Certainly first century Jerusalem was famous and known throughout the world. However, when you study Revelation 17, verse 18 in the original language, and many commentators point this out, and you study Revelation 1, verse 5 in the original language, what you see is those two sentences are, except for a few cosmetic changes, those two sentences are parallel and very similar. And what's going on in Revelation chapter 1, verse 5 is talking about Christ's coming political authority over every nation of the world. And so when that identical phraseology is used in Revelation 17, verse 18, I don't think it's just talking about a famous city or a well-known city. It's talking about a city that is exercising political jurisdiction, political control over the nations of the earth. And certainly, first century Jerusalem, although she was a famous city, in no sense had political authority over the nations of the world. In fact, Jesus in Luke 21:24, speaking of first century Jerusalem, never portrays Jerusalem as somehow exercising authority over the world. He says Jerusalem will be trampled down, trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, Luke 21:24. Heck, how are we going to argue that Jerusalem was controlling the entire world when Jerusalem herself was under the authority of Rome at the time? It makes very little sense. And so Greg Beale kind of sums up the matter. He says it is fatal to the preterist view that the influence of Jerusalem was at its lowest in the 2 centuries preceding AD 70. Whereas Babylon's demise in Revelation 17 and 18 is an immediate fall from great power and prosperity. Another argument that they rely upon is Revelation 18, verse 4, where it speaks of the command for God's people to come out of Babylon, God's people to flee. And typically what many preterists do is they identify this with the flight to Pella as recorded by Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. And the basic response I would give to that is you've got a massive chronological problem, if that's how you want to argue. And the reason is because preterists believe the book of Revelation is written about AD 65, and it's a prophecy about the coming Jewish war, AD 66 to 70. And the problem is the flight to Pella took place before the Jerusalem war even started. Here is Philip Schaff commenting on Eusebius' statement. Schaff says, Eusebius puts the flight to Pella before the war, or 4 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So how in the world can Revelation 18 verse 4 be a prediction about the events of the Jewish war and then suddenly go backwards 4 years and describe something that already happened? Most people believe that by the time the Jewish war came into existence, there couldn't have been much of a flight because there was no room for escape. Josephus writes, for the Jews, along with all egress, every hope of escape was now cut off. Well, there's another argument that preterists use, and this has to do with Babylon's commercial trade. As you get into the book of Revelation, chapter 18, verses 11 through 19, we discover that the city that's portrayed there, who is called Babylon, is basically the center of sea commerce. She's not just the center of commercial activity, but she is the center of sea commerce. Now, how can we argue that Jerusalem is the center of sea commerce when Jerusalem is not even located on the water? Now, here's how they argue. They say, well, keep in mind that Herod was building a port at nearby Caesarea. Now, it is true, there's a reference in Josephus to Herod building a port at nearby Caesarea. But, as you look at a map, you quickly see that Caesarea is about 47 miles away from Jerusalem. First century Jerusalem could not have been the commercial center described in Revelation 18, verses 11 through 19, since Jerusalem was essentially removed from the three major highways, commercial highways of the first century world. And any Bible dictionary will tell you this. If you look up Jerusalem, you'll see this comment typically. Here's Nelson's. It says, unlike many other ancient cities, Jerusalem is neither a harbor city nor a city situated on trade routes. So how are we going to argue that a city not situated on trade routes back in the first century was somehow the commercial center of the world? It makes very little sense. As we get into Revelation 17, verse 1, verse 3, chapter 18, verse 17, you have two geographical clues that are given to identify Babylon. She is associated with the wilderness. Revelation 17, verse 3. She is associated with the waters. Revelation 17, verse 1, and Revelation 18, verse 17. So they make a big deal about Revelation 17, verse 3, and the connection to the wilderness. But the problem is, as you go through the Old Testament, what you start seeing is that Jerusalem is distinguished from the wilderness. Here's one small passage that does this. God says in Ezekiel 20, verse 15, I also swore to them in the wilderness, that's the children of Israel in the wilderness, that I would bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. So there you see the land of Israel, Canaan, would be distinguished from the wilderness, and yet John in Revelation 17, verse 3, is associating Babylon with the wilderness. So we have a geographical problem. We also have a problem regarding water. The harlot is portrayed as sitting upon many waters, Revelation 17, verse 1. And as you look at Revelation 18, verse 17, you see all of these nautical terms. Helmsmen, passengers, sailors, those who work by the sea, also interestingly used in Acts 27, verse 11, to depict the pilot of a ship. And so what John is saying is this city is a city which is a maritime city. Now, how in the world can we argue that that was Jerusalem when Jerusalem is not even located on the water? In fact, as you look at a map, you see that Jerusalem is 14 miles west of the Dead Sea, 37 miles east of the Mediterranean, 60 miles south of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. And it's very interesting to me that Daniel 11, verse 45, I believe that's a reference to Jerusalem, describes Jerusalem not as on the seas, but as between the seas. Now, the Bible is very good at talking about a city on the water. It does that with Tyre. But you'll notice that it never does this with Jerusalem. It uses this reference between the seas. So Nelson's Bible Dictionary says, unlike many other ancient cities, Jerusalem is neither a harbor city nor a city situated on trade routes. So if we accept that as true, how in the world are they arguing? How can they make the case with a straight face that Jerusalem is the center of all commercial sea activity as John portrays Revelation? And there's a lot of problems correlating the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 with Babylon's destruction as portrayed in Revelation 17 and 18. It's very difficult to associate what we know of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 with the fall of Babylon as described in these chapters. For example, Babylon's fall in these chapters is described as something that will take place suddenly. The references are her destruction will take place in a day. Other references are her destruction will take place in an hour. In fact, her destruction is analogized to a stone sinking into the Euphrates. How long does it take a large stone to sink into the Euphrates? It's something that falls fast. And so what John is saying is that when Babylon falls, she will fall with tremendous suddenness. And this simply doesn't describe the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Most scholars, for example, here's Thomas again, he refers to it as Rome's prolonged siege and destruction of Jerusalem from the 60s to the 70s. In other words, the fall of Jerusalem is not something that took place in an hour. It's not something that took place in a day. It's something that took place over a long period of time. Now, it is true that the temple, there's a reference in Josephus to the temple being destroyed in a day. But I don't think the fall of Jerusalem in this war of AD 66 to 70 took place in a single day. Furthermore, John predicts that when Babylon falls, she will never be rebuilt. In other words, her fall will be final. And if you look at Revelation 18, verses 21 through 23, you will find the expression "not found any longer" used about 6 times in those verses. And as you study that in Greek, what jumps out at you is the double negations. There are multiple double negations used in those verses. And I think all of this is communicating that when Babylon falls, she will no way ever, be in existence again. God will completely destroy her, never to be rebuilt again. Now, does this describe the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70? Well, when Jerusalem fell in AD 70, she did not fall in totality, because guess what? We can see people living in Jerusalem today. Here's a reference from Appian that I found. He says, Appian indicates Pompey destroyed Jerusalem. It was afterwards rebuilt, and Vespasian destroyed it again. And Hadrian did the same in our time. In other words, when Jerusalem fell in AD 70, she was rebuilt multiple times and destroyed multiple times. So that doesn't harmonize with the data that were given in the Bible concerning Jerusalem's fall being final. I like Bullinger's summary of this. He says, the suddenness and completion of Babylon's judgment and disappearance from the face of the earth is one of the prominent features of this prophecy, and it effectively proves that it has not taken place. One of the things that's very interesting is that when Babylon falls, Revelation 19, verses 1 through 6, depicts heaven rejoicing. The 24 elders are rejoicing. The 4 living creatures are rejoicing. Now, would the angelic world, would the elders, would they rejoice at Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70? I think not, because Christ himself wept over the prospect of Jerusalem's fall. In Luke 19:41, you'll find a reference to Christ speaking of the coming collapse of Jerusalem in AD 70, weeping over it, as did Jeremiah before him, as recorded in the book of Lamentations chapter 2, verse 11, when Babylon fell to Nebuchadnezzar. So it's a little bit incongruous to argue that Christ is weeping over the prospect of Jerusalem's fall, yet when Jerusalem falls in AD 70, the heavenly entities are celebrating. Seems a little strange. Well, let me take you to a few arguments that they use from outside Revelation 17 and 18 to argue that this harlot city, Babylon, is somehow first century Jerusalem. And of course, very prominent in their thinking is something we've dealt with in this group many times in the past, so I won't belabor it, but it's these so-called time texts, shortly, quickly, takos, near at hand, engis, about to or on the point of, mellow, and those show up in Revelation chapter 1, they show up in Revelation 22 and a few other places. And so what preterists do is they attach a chronological significance to these words. And they basically argue that because John is saying these things will take place shortly, it had to take place in the generation of the apostles, and so therefore Jerusalem, first century Jerusalem, is in view. So here's Russell, he says Rome, heathen or Christian. See, he's dismissing the Rome view. Rome, heathen or Christian, lies altogether outside of the apocalyptic field of view, which is restricted to things which must come to pass shortly. To wander into all ages and countries in the interpretation of these visions is absolutely forbidden by the express and fundamental limitations laid down in the book itself. So he's saying these so-called time texts demand that the harlot of Revelation 17 is first century Jerusalem. And of course, we respond by saying those so-called time texts are interesting, but they're not always chronological. You're assuming they're chronological, but those texts can be used in an adverbial sense, describing chronology, describing quality rather than chronology, and they could also be used to describe something that is imminent. That's how takos is used in Acts 22:18. It's used adverbially there rather than chronologically. Engis and mellow can be used in the sense of imminency. That's how those words are used in Philippians 4, verse 5 and 1 Peter 5, verse 1. So we need not assume that those are automatic chronological expressions. They're doing a great deal of work in non-canonical literature. How do you develop a hermeneutic which says global events, these to me look like global events, don't they? The greatest earthquake in human history, those types of things. Babylon exercising jurisdiction over the entire world. How do these global events fit into the local events of AD 70? Well, their argument is these are hyperbolic expressions. So notice, and they, by the way, analogize the book of Revelation to other non-canonical literature. And they say, well, John is just like these other non-canonical books called apocalyptic literature. Those non-canonical books speak hyperbolically. So obviously John in the book of Revelation is speaking hyperbolically. So here's Gentry. He says, the preterist view does understand Revelation's prophecies as strongly reflecting actual historical events in John's near future, though they are set in apocalyptic drama and clothed in poetic hyperbole. Hank Hanegraaff says this, apocalyptic hyperbole, to underscore the distress and devastation that would be experienced when Jerusalem and its temple were judged. Don Preston, he says, the Sibylline Oracles says, all creation was shaken when Jerusalem fell. This was not a reference to a literal earthquake. So this is the method hermeneutically that he's using to argue that John's description of the greatest earthquake in human history somehow occurred in AD 70. He's developing a hermeneutic of hyperbole from non-canonical books and reading it into the book of Revelation. And one of the major problems with this is there are sections of the book of Revelation that preterists take with ironclad literalism. For example, the temple of Revelation 11 is a description of a literal temple. Heck, these are the folks that are arguing that the name 666 is so literal it spells out Nero's name. And then they switch, I think it was FDR who says don't switch horses in midstream. They switch horses in midstream hermeneutically, and they start arguing from hyperbole when the text goes beyond the events of AD 70. And, of course, Dr. Thomas in his book, Evangelical Hermeneutics, has a very nice chart there where he is distinguishing the non-canonical literature with the book of Revelation. Everybody today is arguing that those two categories of literature are the same. Going through a lot of my PhD studies and reading the book, The Four Views of Revelation, I saw practically everybody in this book, except Dr. Thomas, the lone dispensationalist in the book, arguing a hermeneutic from non-canonical literature. Yet this chart here is very helpful because it distinguishes Revelation from the apocalyptic non-canonical material. Now, preterists not only appeal to the non-canonical apocalyptic books, but they're doing a lot with the Qumran hermeneutics, the Dead Sea Scrolls. How can the prophecies aimed at Babylon be redirected at Jerusalem? In other words, how can you read a passage like Revelation 17 and 18, where it keeps talking about Babylon's fall, Babylon's fall? How can that language suddenly be redirected so that it refers to the city of Jerusalem in the first century? And what they note is a technique called Pesher hermeneutics. They note the Qumran community took prophecies originally aimed at Nineveh and Babylon and redirected those prophecies at Jerusalem. And so they say, well, heck, if the Qumran community was doing it, John is obviously following the same practice here. So notice what Ford says. Ford wrote a scholarly commentary on the book of Revelation. I think it was published back in the 1970s. And she says, if Ephraim was seen in such light, and such metaphors were used of her at the time the Qumran community, the commentaries were written, the same accommodation might well have been made years later with reference to Jerusalem under the Romans. The basic response to this, I think, is the Qumran community was a breakaway group and therefore non-representative of mainline Judaism. The Qumran community, and this is from a correspondence with Randall Price, was not involved in Old Testament exegesis, but rather was functioning under the authority of the teacher of righteousness. The Qumran community seldom respected the original intent of an Old Testament passage. In fact, at the very bottom of the screen, I've got a very interesting article from Fitzmyer, written in a New Testament journal, and he goes through I think about 40 Qumran citations of the Old Testament. He finds that only 7 of the 40 respected the original intent of the Old Testament citation. So I don't think this argument that because the Qumran community was doing it, John was doing the same thing really makes sense. I mean, I think John was so busy recording the vision that was given to him by God on the Isle of Patmos, I don't think he had a lot of time to think about what the Qumran community was doing. A major argument that preterists rely upon is audience relevance. Here's Don Preston. He says, but suggesting that Revelation simply depicts a yet future time at the end of history, one has to ask how all of this was relevant or comforting to John's audience. The idea suggests that John was writing to suffering saints longing for vindication, and yet God ignores those urgent pleas to tell them of events and times unrelated to their traumatic situation. This completely undermines the occasional nature of the book. And what they're saying is when we take Revelation 4 through 22 and put it into the distant future, we are ignoring the needs or the relevance to the original audience. And my response to that is, heck, Old Testament prophets did that all the time. It's very common for Old Testament prophets to comfort God's people in the present with a vision that was yet to be fulfilled in the distant future. Isn't that what Isaiah is doing in Isaiah 40 through 66? Ezekiel 34 through 48, Amos 9, Zechariah 12 through 14. Heck, John is just doing the same thing. This is a common way that God comforts people by giving them a vision of something that is to be fulfilled in the distant future. Preterists take Isaiah 53 literally. They take that as a messianic prophecy. Yet Isaiah 53 had nothing to do with the original audience of Isaiah. That was a prophecy that would be fulfilled 700 years later. So why can't John be doing the same thing? Let me sort of wrap up our thoughts, but let me give you, in general, some general weaknesses with the preterist position and what they're doing with Babylon. The obvious problem that they have is the date of the book of Revelation. Revelation cannot be a prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 if the book of Revelation was written 25 years after Jerusalem fell in AD 70. So the late date of the book, in essence, destroys the view. Preterism is the only eschatological position which is date dependent. My view of the book of Revelation, date it whenever you want. Date it in the 60s, date it in the 90s. It doesn't affect my view at all, but that's not true with their position. And preterists acknowledge this. Gentry says if the late date of around AD 95 to 96 is accepted, a wholly different situation would prevail. The events in the mid to the late 60s of the first century would be absolutely excluded as possible fulfillments. And so if you have any doubt about the date of the book of Revelation, I would encourage you to read Mark Hitchcock's dissertation and refer back to the debate that he had with Hank Hanegraaff a couple of years ago. And I think the date of the book of Revelation during the time of Domitian is pretty well established in the 90s. Another problem, I think, with the preterist position is Old Testament prophecies concerning Babylon. I know there's disagreement about this even in this group, but I still believe that when we take a literal, grammatical, historical interpretation and apply it to Old Testament prophecies concerning Babylon, these prophecies have never been fulfilled. I don't think Isaiah 13 and 14 has been fulfilled. I don't think Jeremiah 50 and 51 has been fulfilled. I don't think Zechariah 5, the woman in the basket taken to Shinar, has been fulfilled. Even John Walvoord says the city, that would be Babylon, continued in some form or substance until AD 1000 and did not experience a sudden termination such as anticipated in this prophecy. And there he's speaking of the Old Testament prophecies concerning Babylon and how they are yet to be fulfilled. Now, if these prophecies have never been fulfilled, when are they going to be fulfilled? When is Jeremiah 50 and 51 going to be fulfilled? Well, this is where I'm indebted to Charles Dyer, who parallels so beautifully the things mentioned in Revelation 17 and 18 with the language of Jeremiah 50 and 51. Jeremiah 50 and 51 will be fulfilled when Babylon falls in Revelation 17 and 18. Mark Hitchcock has a very nice chart showing the similarities between the woman in the basket in Zechariah 5 and the harlot in Revelation 17 and 18. So I believe that's when Zechariah 5, verses 5 through 11, will be fulfilled. So what's my point? My point is there's no place for the Old Testament prophecies concerning Babylon's destruction to be fulfilled if Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 is really the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. See, if you preterize Revelation 17 and 18, now you're forced to preterize all of these other Old Testament passages as well. Babylon's idolatry is a problem for them. Everybody agrees that by the time the Jews emerged from the Babylonian captivity, idolatry was a thing of the past. Here's what a Bible dictionary says. It says, the captivity of the people of Israel at the hands of the Babylonians produced a permanent cure for the sin of idolatry. Never again, even to the present time, has Judaism succumbed to idolatry. In the Gospels, there is virtually nothing about idolatry. That's a problem for their position because as you get into Revelation 17 and 18, you'll find John using terms and expressions that are typically associated with idolatry. Not only in other sections of the Scripture, but also in the Apocalypse itself. So if you do a word study on demons, you'll find an association with idolatry. Porneia, pharmakia, these are all terms in Revelation 17 and 18. Kathartos, you'll see it oftentimes linked with the sin of idolatry. And so there are 5 words in Revelation 17 and 18 associated with the technical sin of idolatry when used elsewhere in Revelation and the rest of the Scriptures. So what's the point? The point is, therefore, how can idolatrous Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 represent non-idolatrous, monotheistic first century Jerusalem. So I saw that as sort of a problem. And one last thing is Babylon's similarities with Tyre. Preterists, in essence, argue from similarity. They try to develop similarities between Revelation 17 and 18 and various descriptions of Jerusalem. That's what they were doing with the title on the harlot's forehead. They do that with references to the great city. There's some double recompense language in Revelation 18, verse 6. They say that's very similar to how Jerusalem is described. And so what is the response? The response is, well, John is applying imagery from the destruction of multiple past cities, including Jerusalem, to describe Babylon's fall. And commentators all acknowledge this. Here's Pre-Trib. He says that Revelation 17 was obviously inspired by Jeremiah 51. The model for Revelation 18, on the other hand, is found in Ezekiel 27 or 28 in reference to Tyre. Steve Gregg says the entire chapter is filled with allusions to Old Testament prophecies against Babylon, Tyre, Sodom, and Jerusalem. The specific details do not need to be pressed as applicable to the present case if we accept the meaning that, in principle, the judgment of this city is like God's historical judgments upon great cities of the past. So what is my point? My point is this. If it is valid to identify Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 as first century Jerusalem based on similar imagery with Old Testament descriptions of Jerusalem, then by the same logic, Tyre, Sodom, Assyria, Nineveh, and Edom are equally viable candidates for the identification of Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. In other words, an argument from similarity is no argument, because I could make a case that, well, these chapters really represent Tyre using the exact same logic. So sort of in conclusion, what I've tried to do in this presentation is to respond to many of the arguments that preterists use from within Revelation 17 and 18 and outside of Revelation 17 and 18, many arguments that they use to identify the city mentioned here as equating it with Jerusalem. I've tried to respond to that, and then I've tried to articulate some general weaknesses with the preterist position. Really, the bottom line to the whole thing is when you're trying to identify Babylon or Revelation 17 and 18, cross first century Jerusalem off your list. What's described in these chapters is something futuristic. It is something yet to come, and the details of the text really go beyond a first century Jerusalem identification. If you're interested, I have a few copies of a dissertation that I wrote on this subject at the back table where I go into a lot more detail. So if this sparks your interest, you can see me about that. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you.